So Dr. T is a cognitive psychologist who uses psychophysiological indices such as EEG and ERP and eye tracking to understand typical and atypical cognitive functioning across the lifespan. So our research interests include the development of novel brain-based assessments for documenting sensory and/or cognitive functions independently of overt behavioral responses. And this is particularly valuable because it makes such assessments suitable for use in individuals with a wide range of intellectual and adaptive functioning. As I mentioned, she's just relocated from Vanderbilt. She has her PhD in 2002 from the University of Kentucky in Louisville. And she has numerous publications, well over 100, as well as many grants, including the current R01. So thank you very much, and I would like you to join me in welcoming Dr. T today.
Well, thank you. It's exciting to be here. I had a great day meeting lots of interesting people and having exciting conversations, which hopefully will lead to a few collaborations. At least we'll have some tentative plans. But for the next hour, we're going to talk about some of our brain data and kind of the bigger picture of what it tells us about how our communication and language system comes to be the way it is. And again, as a full disclosure, I do work primarily in developmental disabilities, so it's autism and various genetic disorders, with the idea is that when we look for things, how things go wrong, we can get a good insight of what are the critical elements for things to go right. So studying autism or other genetic disorders will give us insight what is necessary for optimal communication and language development. And in my lab, we use EEG, electroencephalography, as our tool of choice, mainly because it's probably one of the easiest ways to measure the brain. Again, fewest risk and exclusion factors. Our kids or adults have to come in, wear a silly hat. Pretty much the rest sit in your living room, or we can do it in the lab or in school anywhere. And we get lots of squiggly lines, which track information processing as it happens. So we're really looking millisecond by millisecond. So we are measuring thought as it unfolds. And again, with the size of the peaks and the timing of the peaks and the scalp distribution will inform us about how efficiently the brain is working, which networks are involved, and we can get all that done without having to ask any questions. We don't ask anybody to point, we don't ask them to fill out a bubble sheet, we don't ask them to self-reflect, because we're kind of letting the brain do the talking. We're not mind reading, but we're getting close. So for today, we're going to focus on communication. Most of you probably don't remember what you did to acquire your native language. With the exclusion, maybe again, if you had a language disorder that needed some help with an SLP, where you remember it being kind of practice and work, most of the time it just happens. And how do we get from a fetus who hears something very low pass filter, some sound, to a great speaker who inspires hundreds of thousands to do great things? Well, again, it just happens. But most of the time in our real life, we don't always, well, at least not all of us, strive to be that speaker given the next moonshot speech. We really want to get sure that we can get around. We can talk to our friends and family, we can understand them, they can understand us, so that we can get through the day and not feel fully isolated. But yet, communication and language difficulties are not that rare. So again, I didn't have to go with a 10 by 10 little grid of 100 people saying how many out of 100. And we're actually going to do away with 12. 1 in 12 kids between 3 and 18 will have some form of a language or communication disorder. It can be dyslexia, it can be specific language impairment, it can be articulation problem, but again, it is fairly common. Causes are diverse. Genetics, brain injury, car wreck, all kinds of things happen. What we're trying to figure out is why it happens, how we can intervene, how we can prevent. When we think about this, the approach is, again, the active ingredients are known. You need to have a brain, because all the behavior tends to come from a brain, and you're not going to have somebody, in this case of communication, somebody to talk to, or somebody who's going to talk to you. So we're going to have the brain and we're going to have the environment. Nature, nurture, they're going to interact. That's probably the most standard approach. What I'm going to argue is saying that this model is informative, but that doesn't tell you the full story. There's going to be an extra secret ingredient. But let's start with what we know. We know on the brain side that, again, we'll start in the beginning. If you want to communicate, you need to be able to hear. Newborn hearing screening is pretty universal in the United States. It's actually becoming very widespread worldwide. The current view is we want to screen every baby born by 1 month of age to know that they can hear. If they don't pass the screening, we want them clinically evaluated and diagnosed by 3 months, which is again really fast. And by 6 months, we want to have an intervention, whether it's hearing aid, cochlear implant, or something else. Why do we care? Well, because the first year of life is also when you acquire most of your language skills. So you become proficient in native language, so you need to be able to hear. Great. How do we screen for language in this language readiness? Brainstem response. Yay, go brain. Interestingly, brainstem responses were probably the more recent technological advance than playing EEG, but yet they beat us to the clinical world. Because ABRs, auditory brainstem responses, are used clinically, can be interpreted as a single person, and are really informative at saying, yes, this baby's brain can process sound. But then it's not enough just to detect sound onset. Going from quiet to hearing a click, or a tone beep, or a chirp is important, but most of us don't communicate in clicks and beeps and chirps. We communicate in more complex stimuli. So speech is longer, has more frequencies, more dynamic relationship between those frequencies. So the brainstem is not enough. It's not enough to detect sound onset. We now need to have the cortical system to help us deal with the finer distinctions between different types of sounds. Cortex matures much slower than the brainstem since it's a more advanced structure. But what we find is even a fairly immature system, a baby born preterm, not even at the full 40 weeks gestation, their brain system is already reasonably capable of processing speech. So here we'll look again at squiggly lines. What we can see is on the left, babies who are born extremely preterm, before 30 weeks gestation. So essentially they've made it through not quite 2/3 of normal pregnancy. The brainstem and the ear are already there. Some of the cortex is again starting to form, but again, it's by no means a full functioning brain. But their brain can already respond to speech. Babies on the right are late preterm and term, and we can see what's the difference. Well, one has a much bigger response, which really tells us you have more neurons firing in synchrony in response to speech. So your brain is more prepared and organized and coordinated to handle this information. We're also going to see there's a little bit of difference in the waveform shape, the waveform morphology. One has like 2 peaks, one has 1 peak. So it means there's more fine-tuned processing of those speech sound characteristics. And there's going to be differences between bat and pat. So timing difference, or bet and get, which is like slight difference in frequencies that make the B and the G sounds different. We know that having a bigger response, in this case better, reflects more mature state. But again, this is just detecting sound onset, and this is detecting complex sound onset. What is really important for us is not just hear it, but tell the sounds apart. We can see that our very preterm kid who's under 30 weeks, they respond to all sounds, which I hope you can see the sort of dark and lighter shading colors. But at the time of that first peak, our full-term kids do a little better job of differentiating between the sounds. So not only they can hear, but they can say, I heard 2 different things. And this is important because to learn language, you need to know when language is happening, but also need to understand what are the individual sounds that are going to make different words. Because minor change in one sound can change complete meaning of the word, or change from noun to verb and other things. And what we've demonstrated several times now, that the better your brain is at handling the difference between the sounds, now, the better is your prognosis for language outcomes. We find even in our immature system, at babies who are tested at birth, or for the very preterm kids who had to wait till the medical is stable, test them closer to term birth. For even half a microvolt difference, even less than half a microvolt difference, for every difference in terms of you being able to differentiate the sounds, you gain 1 extra point on your language assessment at 6, 12, and up to 24 months. And I say 1 point, who cares? Well, if you are scoring 100, difference between 100 and 101 probably is not a big deal. But if you're scoring 59, from 59 to 60, that can actually mean something. So you can fall out of the extreme disability to probably slightly less extreme. And again, but that's for every like half a microvolt. Those differences we usually measure can be 5, 6, 7 microvolt differences. So there's pretty strong association between your brain sensitivity and your later outcomes. Amplitude matters, timing matters. Our full-term or close to full-term babies discriminate speech sound sooner. They discriminate in the earlier window. Our very preterm kids take a little longer. Makes sense, the brain is less mature. But again, our speech in daily life is dynamic. So you need to keep up. So if your brain is taking 1/10 of a second too long, you won't notice it in behavior. You won't notice in head turn or pointing, or even in school age, you won't even notice it in reaction time. But you will notice it because those are kids whose brain takes just a little too long to do the very same thing. They're more likely to have reading disorders, dyslexia, and issues with grammar and more complex language functions. So being able to detect discrimination and see it happening sooner rather than later is a good sign for saying, yes, this brain is prepared and ready to handle language. Now, preemies is one case. But again, we've also looked at kids with extreme brain alterations, like kids with microcephaly. So that work was done in collaboration with 2 research teams in Brazil. We followed kids with prenatal exposure to the Zika virus, who, again, many of them ended up with microcephaly, which kind of made the world news. What is microcephaly? It means somewhere in the first trimester of pregnancy, there's an insult to the nervous system development, so the brain physically doesn't form the way it should. And you end up with extreme immaturity, some is kind of missing parts, misaligned, not sufficiently folded. There's lots of alterations. Those kids with severe microcephaly have significant developmental delays. So they're born, again, you already know they're going to have microcephaly, and it's detectable on ultrasound. But again, they have motor problems, they have cognitive problems, they have vision problems of various severity, depending on how much of a reduction from the full brain you have. And microcephaly generally doesn't resolve. Again, you don't kind of catch up and grow all the parts. So we're seeing those kids now as preschoolers. And we're looking at the brain response to speech. Same bas and gas, that are some simple basic pieces that we know are informative about language outcomes. So if we look at the brain response, our healthy controls are in the red, the microcephaly kids are in the blue, we can say yes. Kids with microcephaly, the brain does not work the same way. The response is smaller. Well, yeah, the neurons are not quite as numerous. They may be not as oriented to the scalp as the normal brain would be. So yes, there's a structural difference. But what is encouraging to see is that the timing of the early and late peak, like the positive and negative waveform here, is actually relatively preserved. So while the brain is not, in this case, running on all cylinders, it can still do a fair amount of processing. And when we look at sound differences, with now like different colors representing the 3 different consonants, at the top our healthy controls, yes, they start differentiating the 3 sounds again at the first positive peak and again the first 100, 150 milliseconds, with secondary discrimination at around 200 milliseconds. Our microcephaly kids, not so organized and consistent in discriminating at 100 milliseconds, but they are doing the same thing at 200 milliseconds. So in other words, the brain is not fully formed. They have lots of disabilities. The environmental inputs are different, but the brain is still able to make the most of that and learn and start separating those sounds. Now, these kids who are now 4 and 5, 6 years old, many of them on standardized measures, they will function at the level of 6-month-old. Because again, missing portions of your brain is not good for your development. But at least we know that some fundamental things that prepare them to get the auditory input in and get the language around them in is functional, which means they are probably getting some ability to be aware what's happening around them and be sensitive to some of those communicative intents. Now, that was kind of looking at concurrent association at 4 to 5 to 6 months. The ability to differentiate sounds even late was associated with parent report of their babies or their young child's ability to communicate. Even at the level of 6-month-old, those who showed greater differentiation in the brain response were also reported to have more behavioral evidence of being able to interact communicatively. Concurrently, we can also say the same thing if we talk about prediction. We said like in preterms, we can use brain data term to predict what's going to happen in 2 years of age. We can see that in long-term follow-up, the circles in red are kids who were born preterm and had frank brain injury. They had white matter injury, like periventricular accumulation. They had insults to the brain, like parietal strokes. And yet we still see the same relationship between brain discriminating between speech sounds. The more they discriminate, the better their parent report and or direct measure, depending on assessment, communication skills. So what it tells us is you need the brain, but it doesn't have to be absolutely perfect to still handle much of the language processing and early communicative development. And not only it's a correlational relation, it's like, yes, if you do this better, your brain is better too. We've done it now, others have replicated, we've done a mediation analysis, which now allows you to get more causal type inferences, saying, in this case, the difference between you belonging to a group with a disability, like in this case, autism versus control, and the relationship with kids with autism tend to have more specific communication, specific difficulties. And this is quantified as a discrepancy between the nonverbal IQ and verbal performance. If we look at brain's ability to differentiate between speech sounds, again, very basic sensory processing, it explains a fair amount of variance between your clinical group membership and your disability. So it's not just, it just happened, like your height and weight and IQ tend to correlate. Well, in this case, it's not just a random association. There is some reason. And the reason is your brain sensitivity to speech that contributes to presence of communication disorders. So that's a very fast review of what the brain does. And if I can get my computer to behave. Sorry, I got the rainbow spinning disk. What it says again, so from the brain side of things, so we know brain, a lot of this early processing seems to develop regardless of having the perfect brain, whether it's immature, whether parts are missing, which means probably a lot of it is probably genetically driven. Again, we had many years of evolution to train our brain to say it's a good thing to be able to hear and respond to speech, and it's a useful skill to have. So even if things that your environment is not ideal and perfect, you still at least can do something. So you have this readiness, but again, primarily your brain's job is what? Detect sound presence and tell sounds apart. There will be a fair amount of individual differences. Again, somebody has perfect pitch, others don't. But what we see is the magnitude of differences in the timing of sound detection and sound discrimination seem to be the important pieces for helping us understand what is necessary for good communication outcomes. But again, even with mediation analysis, with correlations, it's never 100% correspondence. So the brain tells us part of a story, but it's not a complete story. So then the environment must be filling in the rest of it, right? So we'll say environment must be contributing to everything else, since genetics sets us up for success, but we can't program genetically which language you're going to speak, with how many different people you might want to interact. So you're going to learn, you're born with capacity to process any sounds, but in the first year of life, you learn what is your native language, or what your multiple native languages are, so you become specialized. And that's what most of our development happens, is what the environment does is helps our brain be efficient, means don't expend more resource than you have to, because the brain may be not the biggest organ, but it does consume the most of the body energy, and it's still not an unlimited resource. And if it has to support life, like breathing, body temperature, body posture, and deal with communication, and deal with daydreaming, and like plans to take over the world, you need to ration your resources well. But then in addition to being efficient, it also wants to be somewhat specialized, because again, it's good to be capable to do everything, but it's better to be really good at doing a few things well. And we do it through, again, pruning and through experience-dependent learning. What does it look like practically? So hopefully we can see it with the lights. So I'm going to show you two concurrent videos. These are the videos of electrical brain activity of newborns, typical healthy full-term newborns, tested within the first 48 hours of life or postnatal life in response to speech sounds like buzz and gus. On the right are adults doing the same thing. You're looking at the head down. So the top of the screen is where your nose is. This is the bottom is where your back. Left is on the left, right is on the right. We obviously, since we're dealing with millisecond level precision, 700 milliseconds of an analysis window will be like down in the snap, so we slowed it down a bit. Purple means kind of zero baseline activity. Red means switching go to the positive peak. Blue goes down to the negative peak. What we're seeing is, look at the patterns of how a baby responds to speech versus an adult responding to speech. What you'll notice again, same time frame, same stimuli. We can see that adults are quite a bit different from babies because, first of all, the brain response seems to be doing a lot more things. So it's much more dynamic. There's also a lot of coordination at the crosstalk, left to right, front to back. While the baby technically activates the same parts of the brain, but it's kind of much more slow and far less coordination crosstalk. So we start with, here's some sound, let's throw everything at it and figure out what to do with it, to, I've heard that sound now, I don't know how many billion times by the time I'm an adult, so now I know exactly what to do. I can do it quickly and efficiently without expending resource. Yeah.
Sorry, I just wanted to ask that the yellow on the right side of the newborn, does that mean there's lateralized activation that's stronger in the right hemisphere?
Yes. And now it's also like at 700 milliseconds, a baby brain response takes longer to return to baseline. There is some this is hours of postnatal life. So the experience with the speech is pretty limited. There's some data suggesting that the right hemisphere develops for auditory basic sensory processing a little faster. But again, also because it's so late, again, we're deep into the random individual differences. But I think in this case, we've had about 67 babies and 67 adults in each group. So how do we get from this slow, usable, but not super efficient to this fast and dynamic and do it quickly and correctly? Well, we think is, again, that's your environment. Multiple exposures, your brain builds the highways for processing speech versus non-speech. You practice it enough that the brain says, oh, like all those bars said by your parents and your neighbors and your friends, even though they sound differently, they mean the same thing. So doesn't matter, don't get focused on details that don't matter. So you optimize it, it's going to increase your efficiency. Did the baby go to like language learning school? Most of the time, again, most of us don't. So again, we really do let the environment control it. But also what we learn is you do have tremendous amount of environmental input. Like I was saying, again, we can look at the brain without asking any questions, and the brain will tell us what it's doing. But we also know that your brain is working all the time. And unlike your eyes that you can shut and ignore the visual input, ears tend to be on, whether you sleep, whether you're awake, unless you physically can block them. And again, we already said hearing is important, so we assume all our kids can hear. How do we know that your ears process information all the time? Well, first we figured we'll use our experience, but it's like, we'll do a study. So when in preschool, conveniently was in our same building, is that what if we present information to our preschoolers while they sleep? We're going to present something completely new they've never heard before, has absolutely no bearing on what they might be familiar or thinking about it, and then see, did the brain register it? So kids go through a normal day, at nap time, they go to sleep, we do wire them for sleep EEGs, in this time less pretty than our hairnets and a little more like sticky electrodes. And when the kids really fall asleep, again, which takes about 10-15 minutes after lunch, they get into the slow wave sleep or N2, we present 3 novel, completely nonsense pseudo words, and again, present in random order for about 10 minutes. We want them to sleep and rest. But they have 10 minutes of exposure during slow wave sleep to novel auditory information. Does it matter? Well, they finish their hour and a half nap, they get up, they do whatever they need to do in the preschool, and then we'll bring them to the lab a few floors up. The gap was anywhere between 35 minutes to 2 hours. And then we'll play the words that each kiddo heard during nap, and they all had different words, mixed with a whole other set of new words that are not repeating, and an extra set of new words they never heard that they are repeating. So we're controlling for novelty, we're controlling for repetition, and saying, what does your brain do with that information? Well, you tell me. The red line is the words they heard during sleep. Never heard before, never heard after. Didn't know anything's gonna happen. The brain data said they were asleep. But yet the brain, now awake, treats information that they heard during sleep as different than everything else that's new. it attends to it. So first of all, again, the brain essentially, it's passive listening. Again, 3 and 4-year-olds, you can't really make them do many tasks anyway. But the brain says, this is slightly different than the other things. It sounds maybe worth my attention because maybe something is important about it. But not only they attended to it, they sustain their attention, and it gets into the time window of recall. So it's like, wait a minute, like, didn't we have like many years ago idea like listen to French on tape while asleep and you're going to become very proficient in foreign language? I think people tried it. I don't think it worked very well. But this says it could. Where's the difference? The difference was these kids heard some random gibberish. Their ears did. The brain did. They themselves didn't really. For 2 hours after that, it was stored in the brain. But if they didn't encounter it again and we brought them back to the lab a day or two later, the brain no longer had any trace of it. So in other words, yes, I experienced my environment. I kept that information for a short amount of time, but since there was no reinforcement, there was no follow-up, there was no conscious effort to kind of make sense of it, like, okay, unnecessary, toss it, done. So that's why again, plus again, you need to know when to listen to your French on tape. Slow wave sleep, not REM, not anything else. So, but what else is your kids and the babies who are learning language, they are really using all available information, whether they're asleep or awake. In real life, when the kids are asleep, we don't usually speak gibberish. We speak the words that they've heard before, and we speak words they might hear after. Consequently, all that cumulative experience from awake and sleeping hours is probably contributing to this increased efficiency of the brain handling communicative intent and content of your language. Why is this important? Again, for example, kids with hearing loss. The ones who got detected early, they got their hearing aids or they got a cochlear implant. Common practice is nap time, take the ears off. Some say, well, maybe we shouldn't, because these kids then, they're having less exposure to auditory environment and language than kids who have natural ears at work all the time. And I know, again, some of the companies now work on about fully implantable devices to maximize auditory input for kids with hearing loss. All right, so that is kind of one part of the environment. It's always there, your brain is always dealing with it. And again, with reinforcement, it helps to store it. We'll also find environment's going to show up in many other forms, not just what you say, but again, socioeconomic factors of all flavors have a very strong influence on how your brain handles spoken information. We've shown specifically with lab that nutrition matters, like babies, like breast milk versus formula, proper diet versus junk food diet. Those things will alter how your brain deals with buzz and gas. Like, why should it matter? Remember, brain needs energy to handle complex processing. Nutrition gives you that energy. And if you're young and you need energy to physically grow, mature all the other systems and process speech, then we'll make sure the kids have all the resources they need. Parental substance abuse. Again, we'll look at it from the prenatal standpoint, even something like relatively benign compared to other things as smoking. Babies born to mothers who smoke during pregnancy, one of the things that makes them different is the brain doesn't process buzz and gas as quickly and efficiently as somebody who didn't smoke. So here's your environment altering physical how your brain is going to work. Maternal depression, again, that's probably the more obvious thing. Depressed parents generally don't interact as much, so possibly they're not providing as much of an input, plus medications. There's lots of different ways. Quality of daily care. That can be really simple. How many books does the kiddo have in the room? How many parents living or other family members living in the house in terms of how stable the household is? But you can also think about our preemies. So many of them extreme preemies that spend first few months in the neonatal intensive care unit. Probably not the most communicatively friendly environment. Several studies have shown that aside from various levels in terms of how loud or how quiet it can be, both can happen, it can be too loud and too quiet, but also the type of communication they get exposed to. There's a very sick babies often, so they may be in incubators. The parents don't always have the luxury of spending 4 months in the hospital every day because they have to go to work. Lots of reasons, but NICU babies get up to 1,500 hours of speech input less than full-term babies or babies who don't go to NICU. So lots of reasons, which again, now gets kind of all put into SES as another major environmental factors that are going to affect our brain. And again, SES affects the brain so much that even we can see the effect even in a perfectly healthy, perfectly average, normal, neurotypical brain. Again, back to our Brazil kids, when we look at our control group. So we know they're healthy, we know they weren't exposed to any viruses during pregnancy, and yet when we look at the brain response to speech, in this case, our low SES actually is working harder than our high SES group. Kids who have no developmental concerns, who again have no hearing loss, they score perfectly average on all the behavioral measures, and yet the brain work, the efficiency is different. Why? Again, that's something we're looking at, we don't know. It could be that with lower SES, again, they often live in noisy environments, so you may have to work harder to specialize and optimize your process. So for now, your brain is still working harder than they should. Like the early response is the same. So like sound onset detection and basic sound processing is equal. It's when you start getting into differentiation and finer points of what did I hear, where the differences start showing up. So again, it could be a noisy environment. Again, it could be amount of nutrition. It could be learning opportunities. There's lots of things. And again, we'll have a study now following up on that. But SES, again, it's not just if you're really below poverty line. It's going to matter pretty much across the full spectrum. On that semi-depressing note, let's talk about other forms of environment. And that's what I said, environment should help us learn, right? So here we're going to present brain data slightly differently. On the x-axis, we have gestational age at birth from 24 weeks, which at the time was the earliest survivable age, to 40, full term. On the y-axis, we're looking at postnatal age, chronological age, not adjusted for prematurity, just like how many days and weeks, in this case, months, you were out of the womb. In colors, we're plotting difference between the brain response to one consonant and another. So think of the difference between ba and ga. What we assume is if we look on the right in our term babies, perfectly healthy, born in the right time, as they get older, we see an increase in sound differentiation. As you would expect, they're learning, the things are happening. And we'll look at our extreme preterm kids. So born 28 weeks gestational, less. Same amount of time. Same exposure, although again, accounting possibly 1,500 hours less. But we don't see that growth. Where to go? They can hear, then an EQ. So maybe that's not enough exposure. Or it'd also be that you had the environment, you had all the exposures, but your brain physically was not yet mature enough to benefit from that environment, to benefit from that exposure. People talk to you and you can hear the sound, but you're not yet differentiating. So everything may sound like Charlie Brown's teacher to you, as opposed to finer points of what exactly was said and how. You may notice prosody, but not the individual words. The good news for preemies is, again, 28 weeks, 4 months later, about to get close to term, they go home, they catch up to the full-term kids very quickly. Our brain, especially the auditory system, is very adaptable. And it is probably one of the more plastic systems. So even if you start at a disadvantage and not quite where you should be, when the situation improves, it can kind of play catch up, and again, it doesn't have to go through another 4 months to get to the same point. So environment helps, environment can interfere, and sometimes again, how we're going to respond to the environment will depend on where we are in our physical maturation and how much of that environmental input you're getting. So that kind of brings up a saying, okay, so postnatal environment does fine-tune the brain, makes it faster and more efficient. There are going to be some amount of individual differences in sensitivity to those environmental inputs. Again, we don't have this 100% association or correlation of one between, say, SCS and speech sound differentiation, or between prenatal exposures and language outcomes. So not all experiences and environmental effects will have long-term effects. Yes, you may remember silly words, or at least your brain will remember silly words for a couple hours, but if it doesn't matter, it's going to be lost. So then, okay, brain doesn't explain everything, environment doesn't explain everything, so what is the secret sauce? So what we're thinking is, yes, you need those two parts. They're playing critical role. But to make sense of what else accounts for this variability, we really have to count the baby or the child or the person who we're trying to understand. So, because what we think is this child will affect what the brain does, because again, we pay attention to things we like and we try to ignore things we don't. It will also affect the environment this child is interacting with by seeking out experiences that matter or trying to avoid experiences that don't. And as some of our colleagues sitting here in the room already showed, there's a strong association between what the baby does and what the parent does. And over time, both affect each other. So ruling out a baby out of this system of brain or nature and environment or nurture is really missing an opportunity to really tap into this. So why do we think this? If you look at, especially neuroscience-oriented literature on development, they will say, what do you need? You need adequate neural foundation, so you need to have a functional brain, or at least close to functional brain. You need reliable and precise environmental input, but then you also need active engagement from that brain. And if you say, well, then that sounds exactly like the criteria for opening a sensitive period. Well, it is. Because you're not going to learn things if you're not able to. Again, when we're talking earlier about mouse work, and again, mice communicate in ultrasonic range, I may try really hard, but I won't be able to hear ultrasonic sound, at least not without extra technology. And reliable and precise input, again, we can all have various definitions what's reliable and precise, but we would find, again, general people try to make the best of the situation. Why? Because we, as active agents in our own development and learning, are going to guide that process. How do we know that active engagement matters? Well, we can start and look at the brain again, because again, it's really hard to define active engagement or reflect on it from your own experience. So that work of my graduate student in the past, Sam Gustafson, so she was interested in how brain deals with less than perfect auditory environment like speech and noise. So again, most of our language acquisition and just about most of our adult life happens not in an anechoic chamber where you have just one sound input and everything else is controlled. In real life, you usually have many competing sounds. It can be speech and air conditioning, it can be speech and many other sources of speech. So she started by saying, okay, let's take a group of kids and look how does the brain respond to our favorite speech sounds. When we tell them to just, you'll hear sounds, don't worry about them, watch your video, versus pay attention. So if we look on the left, let's look at the ignore condition. So the kid is saying, you'll hear sounds, don't worry about it. First, they listen to them in quiet, or as close to quiet and you can get in an average quiet room. Listen to bagas. So we have, in this case, those are now older kids, so we have a negative and a positive peak, which is again, sensory detection, early classification of what you're hearing. And then they're hearing the same sounds presented against what's called multi-talker babble, essentially several other voices reading some random text, which kids will have no interest in. I think it was reading sections out of a quantum physics textbook, genetics, and something else. So again, like most 5 to 7-year-olds don't really get excited about this. Now, they're presenting it where the sound of speech is still louder. So it's like talk about like the signal to noise ratio. The sound of speech is, let's say, it's 70 dB, so conversational, comfortable, loud speak. And the babble of fancy science book reading is presented 55 dB. So loud, audible, but not completely masking speech. So what we find is, again, teal line is quiet, purple line is a noise. So what does noise do? Well, because it completely or almost completely obliterates your brain response to speech. We'll say almost completely because what it really does, it makes the amplitude smaller, it makes latency longer, it really starts making your brain look more like a baby brain. Because the things that mattered, the speech sounds, plus things that didn't matter got all mixed together, the brain didn't have good resource to manage it. Okay, so we can't get fully synchronized and separate speech from background noise. Fine. Now we say, okay, kids, now please pay attention to the sounds you hear. Listen to them and tell them apart. Paying attention in teal and quiet, they do just fine again. By the time they're 5 and 7, separating buzz from guzz is a piece of cake. We add noise. Now, noise is still bad, but your amplitude reduction, so this disruption of neural synchrony response to speech is much less. So physically, nothing changed. You're still having terrible auditory input. But the fact of saying, pay attention, you actively try hard to differentiate those sounds, now you're making up for the missing information. Now, the fact is, if you can't do this, and again, that's ability, you have the capacity. Now, will you do it on a regular basis? That becomes a different question. This is the type of data, for example, why OSHA, that regulates all the safety and proper rules, says that a classroom is supposed to have at least plus 16 dB signal to noise ratio, which means like the teacher has to be at least 16 dB louder than any other noise. So we try not to put schools right next to the like landing or takeoff zone for an airport or jackhammering construction, because we need to make sure kids can hear the teacher without working extra hard trying to separate the teacher from noise. Why do we know? It's because active engagement and paying attention, even as well motivated as you might be, has a cost. Remember we said, we acquire language, especially our first language, it seems like it happened. But it seems like it happened while looking back. While you're actively learning it, probably is a lot of effort. Again, think about how when you were learning second foreign language in school, yes, you did it later outside of sensitive period, but it was effortful. Well, the first language might be effortful too. How do we know? Bring the kids in. Again, we have normal hearing kids and the same kids we've done now with hearing loss, both unilateral and bilateral. And ask them to separate those buzzed guys. Pay attention to it actively. So on the left, here's your average brain response to the rare stimulus that you need to detect among the stream of common frequent stimuli. What we see is that rare stimulus produces a bigger response because you were looking for it, you found it, your brain attended. Now the same kids who've spent like 10 minutes doing this silly task, that like what am I, baby? That's easy. Then they go and spend a couple hours of psych testing. Specifically, we're doing language testing. Comprehension, production, pragmatic language. So things that timed and scheduled sort of typical to what a typical school day might be. So you may do 30 minutes of something, take a little break, have a snack, do 40 minutes of something. 2 hours later, when the testing is done, we repeat the sound, the baga differentiation task. The kids do it second time. Most tasks you do second time, it's familiar, it should be easier, you should do as well or better. Our kids don't. What it means is, second time they're doing the task, separating the sounds becomes harder. Why? Because they just spent 2 hours listening and working really, really hard, expanding the mental resource they had for dealing with even simple discrimination. They're tired, they're fatigued. And that reduction in ability to differentiate, and again, we're looking at attentional response. The sensory function is still there. It's just the attentional, deliberate, I'm paying attention, I'm trying hard thing, that's the response that goes away. We see it very common in kids with hearing loss. And those are the kids who, even with hearing aids, they have to work harder during school, so they get tired sooner. That's a kid who you pick out at the end of school and they conk out, not just in kindergarten, but like in middle school and sometimes high school. Fatigue is a fair trade-off for effort. Now, this is simple things and things we ask you to do on purpose. What about all other things you choose on your own to engage with or to attend to on a daily basis? Your choices will be limited by how much energy you have. If you stayed up last night for various reasons, the very next day it's really hard to stay on task and stay engaged and stay focused. Same thing applies to every aspect of development, and especially again, in early life, you're learning every moment because everything is new. And everything is potentially important, so it takes time to figure out what you do and don't need to learn. So can we measure this engagement in our very little kids who don't follow direction? You cannot tell them, ignore, now pay attention, now stay on task. So what we think is, borrowing from psychology and developmental science work, we think is we can measure an engagement in the form of familiarity versus novelty preference. Because what we know developmentally, babies start with, everything is new, I don't know what to pay attention to. And then by about 6 to 9 months, they start exhibiting a kind of familiarity preference because they've learned the ability to figure out what's common and regular versus what's new and different. And familiarity means I paid attention to things happening around me and I stored that information in sufficient detail to recognize. Again, it doesn't just happen randomly. I had to invest some effort to make it happen. And then as they get closer to 12 months, again, they sometimes switch from familiarity to novelty preference, which kind of maps onto like early language acquisition, right? You start by experimenting with every sound, then you figure out the sounds of your language, and you start figuring out those words. And once you've kind of got your basic first corpus of words, say, okay, well, that's enough. I learned these. I want more. Give me more knowledge. So I'm going to go seek out extra words and do other things. Can we tap into this with the brain? Because behavior, again, still the baby may be tired. They may not feel like turning their head or sucking on a pacifier. So let's see if we can look at it with the brain. What we did with the brain is essentially we'll create like a variant of statistical learning. It's like a statistical learning light. What we do is we're going to present them a sequence of nonsense stimuli so that they knew equally to everybody we test. And again, we pick one random nonsense item and we repeat it many times throughout the sequence of constantly changing stimuli. So the idea is, if you're paying attention because you think speech is important and might be carrying useful information, and you're still at the stage where you know like not everything makes sense, but you know most things are words that could be useful, if you're engaged, your brain should notice this repeating stimulus and treat it differently, just like we did it with our sleep exposure kids, compared to things that are constantly changing. What we find is, indeed, brains of babies at 6, 9, 2 months, but now we've even downward extended to even newborns, can notice this repeated silly word. Again, they didn't know what we were trying to do. They definitely weren't trying to help us out, but the brain did. What we find is, at 6 to 9 months, if we look at the difference in response to the repeated and the non-repeated stimulus, and then we'll look at how does it relate to concurrent parent report on baby's communication ability. What we know is that as the difference between the repeated and non-repeated gets bigger, their violent communication age equivalence, so like a maturity measure, shows that they do better. So better detection of silly repeating words, better receptive and expressive communication in a baby. But then we took the same baby's brain responses and then we repeat it again at 10 to 11 months, and suddenly we have almost the same correlation, but in the other direction. So if before more attention to the repeated than non-repeated was associated with better language, now it's more attention to the constantly changing things as opposed to same old boring repeating things matters. And that maps on almost precisely on what's been previously seen in behavioral data, shifting from familiarity to novelty. It's like, okay, well, kind of maybe something in there interesting. Does it really matter? Well, again, maps up on behavior. Let's look developmental over time. So they're the same kids we're following several times. Come on. So now we've plotted the trajectory. So we've seen them between 6 to some up to 18 months. We're still on the y-axis is the difference between repeated and non-repeated. Positive values means you prefer familiar thing, the repeated. Negative values means you prefer new things. And if we look over time, the plots, it looks like a bunch of spaghetti and a complete mess. Well, let's sort them. When we sort them, we're still, again, positive is familiarity, novelty is zero. Something interesting is happening around 10 to 11 months. Group on the left, increasing in their preference for familiarity, so the ability to detect the repeated stimulus, up to about 10 to 18, 11 months, and then they drop. They essentially switch from what they're paying attention to. The group on the right is increasing in the early age, like everybody else, and then keeps going. They still continue pursuing the familiar stimulus. So, okay, well, individual differences will have different things we like, but then we see those kids, they had Mullen, which is going to measure for early development, like a baby IQ, at 12 months and 24 months. The kids who showed a change in preference from familiarity to novelty stayed nice and stable in the Mullen, which again, you kind of expect on standardized measures that you're going to stay more or less the same. The kids who pick familiarity and decided I'm going to stick with it, we saw a 6 to 8 point drop on the Mullen score, which is about half a standard deviation. So what happened? We're thinking is, well, At 12 months, there's very few things you have to yourself do on a Mullen. By 24 months, there's a lot more direct assessment. The demands are higher. Scoring gets a little harder. So these are the kids who probably going to end up, as they're going to get older, we're going to see some developmental delay, probably communication, or the cognitive issue. So in other words, one group on the left is flexibly adjusting what they're engaging with. Group on the right is lagging behind. We didn't get the luxury of following those kids much past 24 months to see if they ever switch to novelty preference and the brain measure. And that would have been a really fun follow-up study, which maybe we'll do next. But it was kind of saying it's what you engage with, when you engage with it, seems to both matter. Remember, they have the brain that's processing sound just fine. They have the environment that delivers all the reliable and constant input. It's now the individual baby's choice of what they attend to and what they stick with that seems to make a difference what's going to happen developmentally. And with that, we're going to switch now. One last kind of a sneak peek at where we're going next with this. Up to this point, we talk about communication in a very basic lab distilled form of can you process speech sound? Can you remember individual words? We know real life is much more complex than that. And in real life, effective communication, whether you're having a fireside chat with somebody or giving a speech to a stadium full of people, it's not a single person action. You're always interacting with somebody. So we decide, let's look how this real interaction happens. Start with school-age kids, because they're bigger, they can follow directions, we can kind of have a little bit more control. But this time we're saying, okay, we're not going to ask you to listen to silly bye and gaza and nonsense words. Why don't we have a conversation, communicate, talk. Teenagers and middle school kids, talk about something fun you did or something you're looking forward to in a break. Deliberately, unstructured. Let your conversation go however it's going to go. Because as close as we're going to get to this daily life. But aside from daily life, we're going to ask you both to wear our goofy spaghetti hats so we can see not only what you do in response to speech, but how do you coordinate from person to person. Because again, colloquially we'll say, oh yeah, we got on the same brainwave and we had a great chat. Well, is it physically happening? Do you really get on the same brainwave? The answer is yes. When we look at the data, on the left we can select the bar graph, so the magnitude of coordination between the two brains. The lower bars is the baseline where you're just sitting in a room but you're not interacting, you're not even looking at each other. The bars on the right sets, the bigger bars are the ones when you're actually engaging in your natural, free-flowing, adult, uncontrolled conversation. One we can find is girls, who are here in the dark bar, are better at this than boys, at least in middle school. Kind of, again, not surprising for many, but there may be some sex differences there. But what we can also see is, if we look at the low brain frequencies, like the slow responses, those are tied to the physical properties. We're sitting in the same room, we're hearing the same sound of the same words. So our brains will fall in sync just because of the physical properties. But then we'll look at the two higher frequencies, and these are the ones that now start varying based on how personally engaged you are in a conversation, how socially motivated you are to continue the conversation. What we found is more getting on the same brainwave, more interpersonal synchrony where the two brains start doing similar things at the same time was tied to fewer social problems. And again, most of those kids were kids with the diagnosis of autism interacting with a typical but unfamiliar to them friendly peer. So it's not enough to just engage me with the input at me, but I also need to engage with the other people. And our brain will tell us that yes, engagement really does mean get on the same wavelength.
Third question. What is the circular correlation coefficient exactly?
So that's like a correlation, but not for the linear function, but for cyclical function.
So it's a phase, that they're in phase in these oscillatory bands? Or
So
they
it's
don't have in phase, it's just power?
It actually takes both. So, all right. So, and again, we started with adults, so like let's go older kids whose brains are sort of like adults. We can now do it in babies. So this is the collaboration we have here with neonatology here at Emory, with baby brain optimization on the Bebop project. So we're looking now at coordination, not between two peers, but between babies and their caregivers. What we find is yes, engagement is good. And in the beginning, caregivers probably do most of the work. We've seen like parents who will score higher on attunement and sensitivity to the baby, we kind of see higher brain-to-brain synchrony. But we're also finding is coordination and some engagement with other people is hard, especially for a baby. And again, the baby who's growing and maturing and trying to figure out everything else around the world, they can't, in the beginning, to stay engaged with you all the time. Again, just like their attention spans are short, their opportunities to engage are pretty short, but they start with little bursts of maybe 8 seconds and take a 20-second break, another 4 seconds, then another 20-minute break, then another 8 seconds. But that starts at birth, at term, at a very young stage. By the time they're 3-month-old and up, they get really good. So the point where the baby and the parent get much more coordinated for a longer period of time and quicker, which means, again, we know that this engagement must be an important skill for life. So, because again, we don't learn calculus in the first 3 to 6 months, but we learn how to get on the same wavelengths with somebody else. So, and that's what makes us think that this engagement, taking active role in interacting with your environment and making sense of it, is the important part that's going to lead to all that rapid language acquisition and rapid communicative and social development that we see. All right, you guys have been awesome, and I know it's late, so if you're going to take away anything from this, what we're going to say is, for a functional communication system, we really need 3 things. We need the brain, we need the environment, which we already knew, but we really need the active engagement from the person who is trying to communicate. Because that engagement is going to regulate what you pay attention to, what you tune into, what sticks with you for more than 2 hours. And timing matters. So right exposure in the right time is great. No exposure at any time, most of the time probably is not great, but individual differences might come out of when things happen, how much, how often, and what did you do with it. With that, I'd like to acknowledge my collaborators at Emory, Vanderbilt, and Brazil, and we can ask all other questions. Thank you.
So you have these 3 factors that you kind of emphasize: brain, environment, and engagement. And as a neuroscientist, I'm wondering why you couldn't think of it instead as the brain is what actually mediates everything, and that you have environment, genetics, social factors that impact the brain.
Very tempting, especially since we do a fair number of mediation analyses. What we think is the engagement is being overlooked on all those other social factors. What I didn't show in the data here in terms of our seeing what does the brain engage with. So when we present same task but like in a visual modality with things that are presumed to be more salient and more likely to attract attention with things that should be probably less likely to attract attention, we see strong differentiation, not in things that should be attracting attention get to form an incidental memory trace, and things that present the same number of times, same thing, but they shouldn't be relevant, they don't form a memory trace. So we think it's really not the genetics, because you have the capacity to see. It's not the cognitive ability, not an environment, because of the same things you've kind of experienced and they're not very particularly unexpected or weird. We really think it is what you choose to allocate attention to.
But that still comes through the brain. And the brain has to mediate your active information seeking.
But is it am I controlling my brain? Because I can tell my brain to pay attention, like without a noise situation where I can ignore it and let things kind of get jumbled, or I can top down fine tune my sensory processing to do better because I have some bigger plans for that information. So we think, again, that's why so we can't take any piece out. We don't say engagement is the only thing that matters. What we think is that we're going to explain why the brain matters, why the environment matters, and how they all fit in together to produce the output we see. So, yeah.
In your account of prerequisites for successful development, you use the phrase reliable and precise input. Give us a quick gloss on
Yeah.
that, but as I'm sure you're well aware of that. history of research on language acquisition. There's a great deal of interest and a great deal of focus. It's been put on so-called poverty of the stimulus. So I was wondering if you could say, rather than a quick gloss, give us a little bit more about what constitutes reliable and precise input.
Well, again, you're absolutely right. The definitions will vary, also vary based on stimulus type. So if we are going to stick with language, like first language acquisition, what we're going to assume is that when somebody says the word bottle, it's going to be used consistently to refer to bottle and not a tripod or something else. So it'll be kind of this reliability of same sequence of sounds tend to apply to the same class or type of objects. Precise will be, again, if we're going to try to teach language, and especially early acquisition, we're going to deliver the sound stimuli not against the background of constantly varying noise where the features are difficult to see. But we can see it's going to be delivered, and again, real life is the same speaker or the same set of speakers going to be dominating the early environment. So you're going to learn to process those sounds as they're delivered repeatedly by the same person, hopefully in some comparable conditions. So you don't have to kind of differentiate, was it a ba or a pa within that person? So you figure out, these are the bas, these are the guys, which then allow you to generalize so that by the time you're 2 and 3 and 4, you differentiate things that are said according to a template versus not. So we know, for example, for word acquisition, the second year of life, where you're really focusing on building the vocabulary. The babies at 12 to 13 months will treat novel words and familiar words in a kind of very diffuse way without much specialization, because again, more words are still unfamiliar. But between 14 to 20 months, as they develop the vocabulary, they switch from hearing words that are similar as treating them as the same. So a bear and a gare, up to a 14-month-old may be treated the same as referring to my teddy bear. By 20 months, that baby will say bear is a word, gare is not. So consistency in terms of saying, figuring out, again, what specific sound combination goes with what specific meaning with what specific object. Does that get to your question?
Sure.
Oh.
I'm curious if any research in this area, or if you've done any research related to kids growing up in a bilingual environment, if there's any differences.
We haven't, but there's a huge literature on that.
So I'm trying to kind of, firstly, really interesting talk, fascinating, thank you. I'm trying to understand the difference, if you see one, between speech perception and language, because certainly in adults, when I think of language, I think about it as being largely modality specific. And we know that children born deaf, who presumably don't have any of these processes that you're talking about, go on to learn sign language, a full language that you use to communicate, much like we use spoken language. So although I totally understand and buy the idea that if you have these early deficits in some of these areas in terms of like phoneme perception, that might snowball and lead to sort of like things. How does that impact language ability in the sense of the ability to communicate information or to comprehend written language, for example? So where does speech end and language begin?
Good question. I want to put my finger in saying this is the border. What we do know is that early speech perception, being like, since we know again the receptive part has to happen first, it's going to provide a foundation for everything else, is important. Again, this whole link between not differentiating sounds quickly enough and having dyslexia by the time you're 8 and 9. So obviously, if you can't hear it well, so then integrating, for example, sound with the letter shape or sound with the word form might be difficult. Again, of course, kids with hearing loss, again, we know again, in the beginning, the auditory system will kind of wait for sound. And again, we'll have experts here who can talk about how this, even kids who don't hear in the cell will try to produce sound. So you're going to get some bone conduction. You can have other ways to get the input. But learning sign language is probably, again, arguably is, again, more goal-directed and focused activity than picking up your, especially if you're a deaf child born to hearing parents. So compared to acquisition of your native language auditorily in your environment. So, yeah.
My question had to do with material culture. So at the very end, when you put everything together, we had brain, we had environment, and we had engagement. I was wondering whether we could somehow, like, it would make sense to look at whether material culture fits into this narrative, whether engaging with materials like objects. So like the baby and the mom are engaging together. There's joint attention.
Yep.
There's actions. So the words that are exchanged are words that are in a sense scaffolded upon actions taking place in between like humans and objects. Is that something
That makes perfect sense. And when again, babies learn concrete things first. They learn ball rather than love because ball is an object that I can interact with. We know that this joint attention is really important. But what does this joint attention mean? Not only just hearing what you said, I'm paying attention to what you're attending, and I'm looking at it too, so I'm choosing to, again, take not just what I heard and what I see, but also infer your intent to help me make sense of it. We know kids who, at least younger kids who have language and communication difficulties, often will have trouble with joint attention. They will often have trouble even with object play. So for the very young kids on the autism spectrum, a lot of early interventions before they're going to target language and communication per se will target joint attention and how do you play with objects, because that helps. Interesting, after age 5, it no longer is critical, because after age 5 it seems to that other more cognitive processes become more important for promoting continued language growth. But in early childhood it's really important.
Your results where you compared the high and low socioeconomic status groups in Brazil, if I understood correctly, the low socioeconomic status group had a more extreme EEG amplitude, and that was interpreted as the brain needing to work harder to accomplish the same task. If I remember right, on some of the other slides, like in the microcephaly and preterm babies, the neurotypical group had a more extreme EEG amplitude, and that was instead interpreted as healthy, normal response. Why is it that we're allowed to interpret it? Were they like different ERPs being measured?
Yeah, so that's a great point, and it's like a big conversation in the field because we only have so many peaks, and we have way more than those 5 or 7 processes that we try to measure. So part of it comes down the time, like at what age, and what are you trying to do? What we find is that on a simple sound detection, it should be really automatic and should not require much effort. While sound differentiation, telling apart the sounds, might take a little more effort. So the SCS plot we showed was averaged across multiple sounds, while the microcephaly will look at individual sounds. And again, we'll also see it in expending more effort in the beginning is good. Sustaining that effort long-term may not be as adaptive. We see similar patterns in kids with, like older kids with language and learning difficulties, where they engage processes that would have been developmental adaptive when they were 3, but they do it at age 7. So the brain response looks bigger because, again, it's still working harder than it should to perform the task, while the typical peers have kind of mastered it enough that by that age they decrease their brain response.
Okay, so in the figure that it was comparing like microcephaly versus neurotypical, do you think that is still, that amplitude does have some correlation with effort there?
Yeah, well again, microcephaly was starting to this completely structural insult there. Plus we have, again, those 25 kids, which is probably at the moment still one of the larger samples of cortical brain response, but it's still very variable. So at that point we really need to start looking at individual kid to really make sense of it, because we may have some kids who have a bigger response and some kids who have no response. But in that group average, it kind of cancels out. So, but looking at individual data probably will get to that question.
I have maybe a final question. I was very interested in the study with the neural synchronization, and I wasn't quite who you studied in that. Who was the subject population? Was that you were comparing people with diagnosed communicative deficits, or were this just a full range of?
So in the school age kids, that was kids with autism, boys and girls paired with the